I'll say it plainly. Professor Edmund Hale swept his gaze across 200 students in the tiered lecture hall of Emerson Hall and let the silence stretch for a full 3 seconds before he continued. No one in this room has the mathematical foundation to solve this problem. Not this semester. Possibly not this decade. He tapped the whiteboard behind him. 4 lines of dense notation, a proof that had stumped graduate researchers at 3 universities. Then he looked out at the room with the expression of a man who had long ago stopped expecting to be surprised. What he didn't know, the young woman in the last row of the upper tier, the one in the gray hoodie who hadn't spoken once in 7 weeks of class, had already solved it. Twice. 3 years earlier, Imani Ose had never seen a building like Emerson Hall. She'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cleveland's Glenville neighborhood, where her mother worked the early shift at a hospital laundry facility, and her grandmother managed the household with the particular quiet authority of a woman who had raised 4 children on a single income. And considered dignity non-negotiable, the apartment smelled like jollof rice on Sundays and ironing starch the rest of the week. The bookshelves were crammed. Novels, almanacs, a 1988 encyclopedia set that Imani had read cover to cover by the time she was 9. There was no money for tutors or academic camps. There was a library card, a second-hand graphing calculator, and a grandmother who told her every morning, without variation, the work you do in secret becomes the surprise they weren't ready for. Imani had won a full scholarship to Harvard at 17, not through a prep school pipeline or a legacy connection, through a math competition, the hardest undergraduate mathematics examination in North America, which she had entered as a high school junior after her AP calculus teacher drove her to the testing site in his own car, because there was no school budget to cover the fee. She had scored in the top 15 nationwide. Out of 26,000 competitors, she was the only black girl in the top 50. Harvard's math department had sent a letter the following week. She arrived on campus with 1 check bag, a graphing calculator she'd owned for 4 years, and the particular self-containment of someone who had learned early that the people most likely to underestimate her were also the ones she would eventually surpass. She enrolled in Professor Edmund Hale's graduate-level real analysis course as a first-year undergraduate. She was the youngest person in the room by 4 years. She was one of 3 black students in the entire department. She sat in the last row of the upper tier, took immaculate notes, and said nothing. Professor Edmund Hale was by any objective measure one of the finest mathematical minds of his generation. His office on the 3rd floor of the Science Center was a controlled explosion of monographs and preprint papers, organized in a system that only he understood. 3 Fields Medal recipients had been his doctoral students. His own work in harmonic analysis had reshaped the field twice. A 1994 paper that had taken 7 years to write, and a 2008 follow-up that had taken another 5. The walls of his office held no photographs, only a single framed note from his dissertation advisor at Princeton. The problem doesn't care about your feelings. Solve it. He had internalized this. He was 61 years old. He had spent his entire career at institutions where the corridors were paneled in dark wood, and the furniture cost more than some people's annual salaries. The faculty club dining room, with its leather chairs and white tablecloths and the particular hush of intellectual prestige, was where he ate lunch 4 days a week. He held his field in high regard and believed, with the conviction of someone who had spent decades being right, that he could identify talent at a distance. He could spot the students worth investing in during the first 2 weeks of a course, the ones who asked the right questions, who stayed after class, who emailed him with considered follow-up thinking. He had not noticed Imani Ose. He noticed the students who spoke, who raised their hands, who introduced themselves at the department colloquium with firm handshakes and confident eye contact, the ones who already understood the social architecture of academic mathematics, who referenced his papers in their emails, who name-dropped their undergraduate advisors from schools Hale recognized. Those were the students he tracked. The quiet ones in the back row he filed, without conscious malice, into a category he never examined too closely. Solid enough to be here, probably not remarkable. He was wrong about Imani Ose in a way that would become, within 1 academic year, the story the department told for a decade. Here is what those 7 weeks of class looked like from the last row of the upper tier. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 10:15 a.m., Imani arrived at Emerson Hall 7 minutes early and took the same seat. She laid out 3 things: a spiral notebook, a mechanical pencil, and a folded sheet of paper on which she had worked through that day's material the night before, in full before the lecture happened. Not following along. Previewing. She had been doing this since the 8th grade, when she'd realized that the students who seemed naturally gifted weren't gifted at all. They'd simply seen the material before everyone else. She had decided then that she would always be one of those students, regardless of what resources she had or didn't have. She watched the class with the methodical attention of someone cataloging data. Professor Hale taught the way brilliant people often teach, at the pace of his own comprehension rather than his students. He would move through a proof with 3 steps visible, assume the audience had filled in the other 7, and look up with faint impatience when questions arose that he considered elementary. The graduate students in the front rows exchanged glances. The undergraduates, there were 6 of them, scribbled furiously and looked worried. Imani did not look worried. She wrote steadily, compactly, her notation precise enough that when she later reread her notes, they required no supplementary explanation. What none of her classmates knew, she had a notebook at home, a second one, in which she was doing something different entirely. For 4 weeks, she had been working on a problem she'd encountered in the course's supplementary reading, a reference Hale had dropped in passing, the kind of aside that a professor includes, not because he expects anyone to follow up on it, but because it makes him feel complete. He'd mentioned a conjecture in harmonic analysis that had been open for 11 years, first posed at a 2013 conference in Zurich, a problem he'd said almost under his breath, with a small smile that was interesting to think about even if a solution was likely years away. Imani had written down the citation in the margin of her notes. That same evening, she had gone to the library and pulled the original paper. She read it 3 times. Then she went home and started working. Remember this detail. It matters more than it seems right now. 3 weeks into working on the problem, Imani got stuck, not in the way that students get stuck, frustrated, discouraged, ready to walk away. She got stuck the way mathematicians get stuck, which is a completely different thing. It means you've gone as far as the obvious path takes you, and now you have to find the door in the wall. She had filled 16 pages of her second notebook. She had tried 4 separate approaches, eliminated 3, and developed the beginning of a 5th that felt, in a way she couldn't yet articulate, like it might be moving towards something real. She went to office hours, not Professor Hale's office hours, the teaching fellows, a doctoral student named James Park who held sessions Tuesday afternoons in a seminar room with a folding table and a whiteboard that still had residue from the previous meeting's equation. James was thorough and patient and genuinely interested in pedagogy, which made him unusual in the department. He looked at what Imani had been working on for 11 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at her. "Where did you find this problem?" he asked. She told him, "And you've been working on this for 3 weeks?" "Yes." He turned back 3 pages. He traced a line of reasoning with his finger. "This approach here on page 9. Have you taken this any further?" "That's where I'm stuck." He thought for a moment. There's a 2017 paper by 2 researchers at the University of Chicago that gets close to this framing. Not this exactly, but close enough that reading it might show you where the wall is. She found the paper that night. She read it twice, and she saw, in the way that people who are wired for this kind of thinking see, that the 2 Chicago researchers had stopped at precisely the same wall she had, and that they'd stopped because they'd tried to go over it. What they hadn't tried was going through it. What they hadn't tried was a particular reformulation of the boundary condition that changed the shape of the problem entirely. She stayed up until 4 a.m. By morning, she had 14 more pages. The day of Professor Hale's bet, because that is what it became, whatever he intended, was a Thursday in late October. The lecture had covered the theoretical framework underpinning a family of problems in harmonic analysis. Hale had been building toward this for 2 weeks. He was in the particular mode he entered when he was genuinely excited about something, more animated than usual, the chalk moving faster, his explanations expanding into territory beyond the course's official scope. This was, by general consensus among the graduate students, Hale at his best. Even when he was insufferable, he was extraordinary. The 2 things coexisted in him without apparent friction. Near the end of the lecture, almost as a coda, he turned to the whiteboard and wrote 4 lines. Not a practice problem. Not coursework. The Haverford-Ziegler conjecture, named for the 2 Zurich researchers who had posed it in 2013. The 11-year open problem. He wrote it with the careful reverence mathematicians reserve for things that have defeated serious people. This, he said, turning to face the room, is what the field actually looks like when it's alive. Unsolved. Uncomfortable. Beautiful. He paused. Then, with the particular confidence of a man who has rarely been wrong about anything, he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his career. I'll say it plainly. No one in this room has the mathematical foundation to solve this problem. Not this semester. Possibly not this decade. He tapped the board. He smiled slightly. It's good for you to see what you're working toward. Imani's pencil stopped moving. Not because she was surprised, because she was deciding. She sat with it for 20 seconds. The lecture was winding down. Students were closing laptops, reaching for bags. The usual low-grade shuffle of 200 people preparing to exit. And then, in the precise, unhurried way that had characterized her every action in that lecture hall for 7 weeks, Imani Ose raised her hand. Hale almost didn't see it. He was mid-sentence, wrapping up, and the movement in his peripheral vision was so quiet, not the urgent thrust of someone demanding attention, just an arm lifted at a steady angle in the back row of the upper tier, that his brain almost filed at his noise. But he had trained himself over 40 years to catch the edge cases, the outliers, the anomalies. He stopped. He looked up. In the back. The room, most of it already mentally halfway out the door, slowed. Imani lowered her hand. Her voice when she spoke was clear and even. I've been working on it, she said, for about 6 weeks. A beat. I think I have a proof. A graduate student near the front made a small sound. Hale looked at her for a moment. She was the woman in the gray hoodie who sat in the last row, who had never once spoken in class. He did not know her name. He searched her face for the particular combination of expression that meant a student had misunderstood the scope of what he was describing, the eagerness that outran the ability, the confidence that came from not knowing what she didn't know. He did not find it. What he found instead was the expression of someone reporting a fact. Come down, he said. She gathered her notebook, not a laptop, a spiral-bound notebook, and walked down the tiered steps to the front of the hall. 200 students watched. Nobody moved. Nobody packed up a bag. The room had recalibrated its attention entirely. She opened the notebook to a marked page and placed it on the lectern. Then she picked up the chalk. What happened over the next 41 minutes has been described many times since, by students who were present, and by faculty who heard about it, and by people who simply read the department's internal memo that circulated 3 days later. The descriptions share a common element. None of the people who were there quite had the vocabulary for it in the moment. They were watching something that didn't fit the categories they had for watching things in a lecture hall. Imani wrote on the board without rushing. She narrated each step precisely, not performing, not demonstrating, just working. The same way she had worked in her apartment at 3 a.m. over the previous 6 weeks. The proof ran to 9 distinct stages. She had developed a reformulation of the boundary condition in stage 4 that reframed the problem's core constraint, and it was at that stage, when she wrote it out and stepped back, that James Park, the teaching fellow who was sitting in the front row and had been watching with absolute concentration, leaned forward with both hands pressed flat on his desk. By stage 6, 2 graduate students had moved to the edge of their seats. By stage 8, Professor Hale had stopped looking at the board and started looking at Imani. She completed stage 9. She set the chalk down. The room was silent. Hale walked to the board. He read slowly from top to bottom. He went back to stage 4 and studied the reformulation for a long time. He traced the logical chain from 4 through 7 with one finger not touching the board. His jaw was set. His expression was the expression of a man who had spent 40 years building a precise internal model of what was possible and was now running a rapid, involuntary audit of that model. He turned to face her. Your name, he said. Imani Ose. He looked at her for a long moment. There are things that cannot be recovered in the moment they're needed, and one of them is the ability to pretend you knew something when you clearly didn't. Hale had called it impossible in front of 200 witnesses. He was too honest a mathematician, whatever else he was, to pretend he hadn't. How long? He asked. 6 weeks, she said. I've checked it 4 times. He turned back to the board. He spent 3 more minutes on stage 4. Then he said very quietly to the board, as much as to the room, "This is correct." The silence lasted 2 seconds. Then the lecture hall erupted. The 48 hours following were a kind of controlled chaos that Imani had not expected and was not entirely equipped for, though she managed it with the same methodical composure she brought to everything else. James Park sent an email that afternoon to Professor Hale and 2 senior faculty members with the subject line, "You need to see this." He attached photographs of the notebook pages. By evening, Hale had forwarded them to a colleague at MIT and one at the University of Chicago, the same institution whose 2017 paper had, without knowing it, helped Imani find the door in the wall. Both responded within 2 hours. The MIT colleague's reply was 3 sentences. The last sentence was, "Who is she?" The answer to that question moved through the department's informal networks with remarkable speed. First-year undergraduate, full Putnam scholarship, Glenville, Cleveland. No prior research experience, no faculty mentor, working alone, after hours from the supplementary reading in a course she was taking as an 18-year-old among doctoral students. The formal verification process began Friday morning. 3 faculty members in harmonic analysis, independent of each other, reviewed the proof over the weekend. The consensus arrived Sunday evening. The proof was correct. The reformulation in stage 4 was not only valid, it was, in the assessment of one of the 3 reviewers, an approach we should have tried 10 years ago. Her solution to an 11-year open problem would be submitted for publication with her name as sole author. A first-year undergraduate, sole author. Professor Hale came to find her Monday morning. He waited outside the seminar room where she was meeting with James Park. When she emerged, he was standing in the corridor in the particular way of a man who has prepared what he wants to say and is still not certain it's enough. He told her the verification was complete. He told her the submission process would begin immediately and that the department would provide full support. He said without any of the rhetorical ornamentation that typically surrounded his speech, that he had underestimated her in a way that was his failure and not a reflection of her ability. He did not dress it up. He did not qualify it. She listened. She thanked him. She asked 2 practical questions about the submission process, which he answered. Then she said, "I'd like to continue in the course." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "obviously." The paper, a resolution of the Haverford-Ziegler conjecture via boundary reformulation, was submitted to the Annals of Mathematics in January and accepted 4 months later. In the acknowledgments section, Imani thanked her grandmother, her mother, her 8th-grade math teacher, and James Park. She did not thank Professor Hale. He noticed and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She finished her undergraduate degree in 3 years rather than 4, completing a doctoral-level thesis on a related problem in her final semester. She was 20 years old when she graduated. The department threw a small dinner at the faculty club, the same white tablecloth room where Hale had eaten lunch for 20 years, and she sat at the center of the table and ate quietly and answered questions and did not make a speech because she was not the kind of person who needed to. The Putnam Prize she'd won at 17 had a plaque. The Annals paper had a citation count that grew every month for years. But neither of those things was the thing that Imani Osei came back to when she thought about that October Thursday in Emerson Hall. It was simpler than that. 6 weeks of notebooks, 4 a.m. mornings, a grandmother who said without variation, every day the work you do in secret becomes the surprise they weren't ready for. An arm raised in the back row of an upper tier. The clean, unambiguous click of a chalk piece set down on a tray after 9 stages of proof, complete. Not performance, not defiance, just the work. 1 year after the paper's publication, Imani was sitting in a different lecture hall, a smaller one, a seminar room at MIT, where she was presenting preliminary findings from her doctoral research to a room of 12 faculty members and researchers. Midway through her presentation, the woman in the 3rd row, a Fields Medal recipient, one of only a handful of women ever to have won it, raised her hand and asked a question that Imani had not fully anticipated. It required a careful answer. Imani paused for a moment, working through it, and then answered it clearly and completely. The woman in the 3rd row nodded slowly. She wrote something in her notebook. Afterward, she found Imani in the corridor. "You didn't know you were going to answer that," she said, "but you answered it." "I'd been thinking about the adjacent problem," Imani said. "It was close enough. That's what it feels like." she said. That's exactly what it feels like. They stood for a moment in the corridor of the MIT Mathematics building, the afternoon light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sounds of the city 14 floors below, and the particular quiet of two people who understand each other across a gap of 30 years, and every difference that gap contains. Imani returned to her notebook. She had more work to do. She always did. The difference was that now she knew, the way you know a thing that has been tested and survived, that the work was enough. It had always been enough. She had simply needed the world to catch up.